HMS Indefatigable was the lead ship for the class of battlecruisers named for her, being essentially an enlarged version of the preceding Invincible class. Indefatigable epitomized Admiral Jackie Fisher's idea of a battlecruiser, being fast and lightly armored. Commissioned in 1911, she saw extensive service in the Mediterranean and was there when the First World War broke out, participating in the chase for SMS Goeben and Breslau as they made their way to the eastern Mediterranean and the relative safety of the Ottoman Empire. Staying in the eastern Mediterranean in case the German ships attempted a breakout, she helped bombard Ottoman positions in the Dardanelles. Returning to the United Kingdom in February of 1915, she joined the 2nd Battle Cruiser Squadron with her sisters Australia and New Zealand. Being present for the Battle of Jutland, she was battered by shells from the last ship in the German Battlecruiser line, von der Tann. She was struck just above the armored belt by X turret, which exploded in the magazine. A second salvo hit A turret and may have caused a cordite fire. 30 seconds after, her superstructure was hit, and at 4:02 p.m., her magazines exploded. The Indefatigable class has an interesting beginning. As you see, there was a great controversy over the 1908 building program for capital ships. Intelligence suggested that the Germans had stepped up their building program for 1908 to 4 capital ships, with evidence pointing to them building another 4 the following year. Meanwhile, the government under Prime Minister Henry Asquith had only given enough money to build 2 capital ships, as the Sea Lords and Director of Naval Construction did not muster strong enough arguments to be given the funds for more ships. The press reacted rather harshly to this lack of building by the Royal Navy and started to stir up agitation from the general public. With things reaching a fever pitch in the winter, people were demanding an emergency building program be put in place at once. The original program called for 1 battleship and 1 battlecruiser. The cutbacks by the Prime Minister's Liberal government were partially offset by the stir of patriotism in Australia and New Zealand, with each offering to pay for a dreadnought-type ship, making their feelings heard about the cutbacks as Germany continued to build up their fleet. Admiral Jackie Fisher quickly diverted the funds to build 2 new battlecruisers, with New Zealand's donation being a gift to Britain, where HMS New Zealand joined the Royal Navy. At the same time, HMAS Australia joined the Royal Australian Navy, and would be available to the Royal Navy if needed. As I mentioned in my introduction, this class was essentially to be an enlarged version of the Invincibles, with the differences being 1. Nominal displacement increased by 1,500 tons on a length increase of 23 feet, 18-inch beam, and 6 inches on the design draft. 2. Midship turrets are more widely spread. 3. Armoring similar, but distributed rather differently. 4. Design speed unchanged, although in service, Indefatigable was found to be the faster of the ships. 5. Fuel capacity and radius of action increased approximately 388 tons fuel and 380 miles at 10 knots. 6. Other modifications include relocation of the conning tower and some superstructure rearrangement. These come from R.A. Burt's British battleships of World War I. I want to discuss the armor found on the ship a bit more, as it's an interesting subject and a critical component to understanding her demise, where I think R.A. Burt describes it best. Admiral Fisher's dictum, "Speed as armor," was never better exemplified than in this class. Their extremely poor protection made them vulnerable as capital ships. Some of the changes as compared to the Invincible class are that the belt abreast A and Y turrets were reduced from 6 inches to 4 inches, while the right forward on the belt was reduced from 4 inches to 2.5 inches, with the 2.5 inches thick armor being carried all the way to the stern. The main deck armor of 3/4 of an inch outside the forward bulkhead was suppressed, while the main deck armor over the magazines was increased to 2 inches. The lower deck in the forward section was increased to 2 inches, while the aft section was reduced to 2 inches. The armor arrangements for Australia and New Zealand were modified as compared to Indefatigable, and something I will cover when I discuss those ships. As for the particulars, she was laid down in February 1909, launched in October 1909, and commissioned in February 1911. Having a displacement of 18,750 tons and a deep displacement of 22,080 tons, her machinery consisted of 31 Babcock and Wilcox boilers, giving steam to Parsons direct drive turbines, which drove 4 shafts, giving a design shaft horsepower of 43,000 and a top speed of around 25 knots. While on her trial, she managed 55,880 shaft horsepower and a top speed of 26.89 knots. Her armament consisted of 8 12-inch 45 caliber guns and twin turrets, 1 forward, 1 aft, and 1 on either side of the ship in wing positions. The secondary battery consisted of 16 single 4-inch 50 caliber guns. Rounding out the armament, she carried 4 3-pounders, 5 machine guns, and 2 submerged torpedo tubes. As for armor, her main belt was 6 inches amidships and 4 inches at the end, and 2.5 inches fore and aft. Bulkheads of 3 and 4 inches forward, 4.5 and 4 inches aft. Barbettes of 7 inches, a conning tower of 4 inches fore and 6 inches aft, while the turrets had a face and side thickness of 7 inches and 3 inches on the roof and rear. Following her completion, she began trials in October of 1910, with these wrapping up in the first months of 1911, being commissioned on the 24th of February 1911 for service with the 1st Cruiser Squadron as part of the Home Fleet, where she remained until December 1913. In 1912, there was public agitation over the proposed discontinuance of any battleship squadrons in the Mediterranean, so it was decided to deploy a squadron of 4 battle cruisers instead, these being Indefatigable, Invincible, Indomitable, and Inflexible. Indefatigable joined the Mediterranean Fleet as part of the 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron in December of 1913, where she would be stationed in August of 1914 at the outbreak of the First World War. Previously in 1912, as the First Balkan War kicked off, Germany felt obligated to help the Ottoman Empire as they had close economic and military ties, but did not have a sufficient force in the Mediterranean. Also, in case of a war with France, barring the passage of French troops from North Africa to France proper would be helpful. On November 1st, the German cabinet established a Mediterranean division, with the Battlecruiser Goeben as the flagship accompanied by the cruiser Breslau. The two were supposed to stay in the Mediterranean until the autumn of 1914, where Moltke was to relieve Goeben. However, in July, with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, it looked like war was possible. In this long deployment, Goeben had developed leaky boiler tubes, reducing her top speed down to 20 knots. So, in early July, the commander of the group, Wilhelm Souchon, messaged Berlin and took Goeben to the Austrian naval base at Pola. For the next 18 days, the crew worked to replace the defective tubes. On August 1st, she sailed to Brindisi on the heel of Italy, and then on to Messina in Sicily to coal, where she was refused by the Italians as they wanted to maintain their neutrality. After they took on poor quality coal from the German merchant vessels found there, on August 2nd, knowing that war was imminent with France, Goeben and Breslau quietly made their way to the French North African coast, with the port of Beaune assigned to Breslau and Philippeville to Goeben so they could shell them. Meanwhile, the 3 battle cruisers of the British Mediterranean Fleet, Inflexible, Indomitable, and Indefatigable, under the overall command of Admiral Sir Archibald Berkeley Milne. In late July, they awaited orders in Malta, as Britain at this point did not know if she was going to enter the war. However, First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, wielding the power of the cabinet at the Admiralty, personally drafted operational telegrams to Royal Navy admirals and ships. On Thursday, July 30th, Milne received the following orders from the First Lord. Your first task should be to aid the French in transportation of their African Army Corps by covering and, if possible, bringing to action individual fast German ships, particularly Goeben, which may interfere with the transportation. Except in combination with the French as part of a general battle, do not at this stage be brought to action against superior forces. The speed of your squadrons is sufficient to enable you to choose your moment. You must husband your forces at the outset, and we shall hope later to reinforce the Mediterranean. These were followed on the 2nd by Goeben must be shadowed by 2 battle cruisers. On the 3rd, watch on the mouth of the Adriatic should be maintained, but Goeben is your objective. Follow her and shadow her wherever she goes, and be ready to act on declaration of war which appears probable and imminent. Upon being informed that Indefatigable and Indomitable had Goeben in sight, Churchill ordered that she be held as war was imminent. Milne obeyed Churchill's orders from August 2nd and 3rd, that Goeben must be shadowed by 2 battle cruisers, and that the mouth of the Adriatic watched. He dispatched Indomitable and Indefatigable, the 4 armored cruisers Defense, Warrior, Black Prince, and Duke of Edinburgh, the light cruiser Gloucester, and 8 destroyers under the command of Rear Admiral Ernest Trowbridge. With news that Goeben had been spotted heading towards the western Mediterranean, the 2 battle cruisers at Trowbridge's command were dispatched to Gibraltar to prevent Goeben from leaving the Mediterranean. At 9 o'clock that night, Indomitable and Indefatigable left heading for Gibraltar at 22 knots. After the bombardment of Philippeville on the morning of the 4th at 10:34 a.m., Captain Francis Kennedy of Indomitable, the senior of the 2 British captains aboard the battle cruisers, sighted Goeben 17,000 yards ahead, coming in his direction at 20 knots. Passing each other on opposite courses 8,000 yards apart, with the German Admiral Souchon saying, "Not French ships with a big freeboard, but English tripod-mast capital ships of the Indomitable class. I don't dare open fire as I don't know whether England is our enemy. I am astonished that they don't open fire." The British battlecruisers began turning to follow Goeben 10,000 yards astern. Souchon, aware that war might break out at any moment, ordered full speed, and gradually the chase climbed to a speed of 24 knots, with stokers on both German and British ships exhausting themselves in the hot summer sun of the Mediterranean to push their battlecruisers as fast as they could go, with one crew member of Goeben saying, "We worked in air forced down by ventilators. The artificial draft roared and hissed and drove into the open furnace doors, fanning the glowing coal, and swept roaring up the smokestacks. In the engine room, there was the whir of the turbines, revolving at ever-increasing speed. The whole ship trembled and quaked, and the long grey hull shot through the glistening, foaming waters." The British battlecruisers were fouled and were in desperate need of an overhaul. Not to mention, they were short of a war crew, particularly the stokers required to feed the boiler furnaces. Nevertheless, Captain Kennedy of Indomitable kept station astern for 6 hours, determined to stay within range. Churchill initially gave authorization to have the two battlecruisers engage Goeben if she attacked French convoys, but was forced to retract that order as the cabinet did not want the Royal Navy to sink any ships before war was declared. For the remainder of the afternoon, Churchill desired to have Goeben engaged by the battlecruisers, writing, "The Admiralty suffered the tortures of Tantalus. At any moment, the Goeben could have been smitten at under 10,000 yards range by 16 12-inch guns, firing nearly treble her own weight of metal. At about 5 o'clock, Prince Louis observed that there was still time to sink Goeben before dark. At 3 p.m., the battlecruisers were joined by the light cruiser Dublin, with Kennedy posting her outside the range of Goeben's guns on her starboard beam. Kennedy tried to push his battlecruisers to their maximum speed, and it looked like for a few moments that Goeben might be overtaken. However, by 3:45 p.m., Goeben and Breslau were pulling away into a misty haze. Dublin still pursued and kept in contact until 9:52 p.m. At 1:15 a.m. the next day, a signal from Malta informed the Mediterranean fleet that war had begun. Goeben had gone to Messina to coal, and under the rules of war, she could not be coaled by the Italians, so the crew and German sailors on merchant vessels began coaling her from the other German ships in the harbor. Admiral Milne, understanding that his primary mission was to guard the French transports, figured the best way to do that was to concentrate his battlecruisers west of Sicily. Given sufficient warning, they could intercept and confront Goeben. The following day saw Goeben being chased by Admiral Trowbridge's armored cruisers and heading into the Aegean Sea and onto Constantinople, where she was given over to the Ottoman Empire as to compensate the Ottomans for the loss of their dreadnoughts at the start of the First World War when the British seized them. On August 6th, overall responsibility in the Mediterranean passed to the French. On the 11th, the British naval forces were reduced to a vice admiral's command, with the 2nd Battle Cruiser Squadron broken up and reformed in home waters. However, with the French in control of the Mediterranean, they demanded a battlecruiser be on hand if Goeben attempted a breakout. So Indefatigable and Indomitable were assigned to the Dardanelle Squadron, with Vice Admiral Carden taking up command on the 18th of August. Following the integration of Goeben and Breslau into the Ottoman Navy, the ships still maintained their German crews, and with that the British demanded that the crews be taken off. Robert K. Massey and Castles of Steel writes, "The rest happened quickly. The Grand Vizier, protesting that he had not been consulted, threatened to resign, and a majority of the cabinet wished to disavow the violent act, but Enver prevailed. He had only to point to Goeben with her German crew, fezes notwithstanding, and her 11-inch guns, lying off the Golden Horn. On October 30th, the British ambassador presented an ultimatum to Turkey, demanding that the German crews be removed within 12 hours. There was no response. Indefatigable and Indomitable, in company with French battleships, shelled the forts at the entrance to the Dardanelles on November 3rd. The British ships fired 46 12-inch shells at Fort Sed el Bahr on the tip of the Gallipoli Peninsula, blowing up a magazine and raising huge clouds of dust and smoke. The following day saw the Russians declare war on the Ottomans with the shelling of Russian cities by Goeben and Breslau, with the British and French declaring war not too long after. Indefatigable was stationed with the Dardanelle Squadron until January 1915, where she was relieved by Inflexible. Heading to Malta for a refit, she returned to the United Kingdom on the 20th of February, missing the Battle of Dogger Bank. Upon arrival, she joined her sister ships Australia and New Zealand in the 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron, stationed in the mouth of the Firth of Forth. From April to May 1916, she was the flagship of the 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron, while Australia was repaired following her collision with New Zealand. On May 30th, Admiral David Beatty left the Firth of Forth between 10 and 11 p.m., with the 1st and 2nd Battlecruiser Squadrons in the 5th Battle Squadron. By the early afternoon on the 31st, Beatty had made it to the agreed rendezvous point along the Long 40s, close to the Scandinavian coast. That morning, the High Seas Fleet under the command of Admiral Reinhard Scheer left Wilhelmshaven, with the scouting groups under the command of Admiral Franz von Hipper, weighing anchor and leaving at 3 a.m. By 3 p.m., Beatty and Hipper were not too far apart, and initial contact between the battlecruisers was soon made, with Hipper making a turn to the south, understanding that Beatty intended to cut him off from his home base and that he could possibly lead a portion of the Royal Navy into the waiting guns of Admiral Scheer. Intending to close the gap, Beatty increased speed, leaving the battleships of the 5th Battle Squadron behind. By 3:40, the battlecruisers had formed a single line, with Beatty's flagship Lion leading, followed by Princess Royal, Queen Mary, Tiger, New Zealand, and finally Indefatigable. At 3:48, the German guns opened up the Battle of Jutland. Fire distribution was an issue for Beatty, as he intended for Lion and Princess Royal to fire on the leading German ship, Lutzow, while the other ships followed along down the line, with Queen Mary firing on Der Flinge, Tiger on Seydlitz, New Zealand on Moltke, and Indefatigable on von der Tann. Lion and Princess Royal fired on Lutzow as they should have done, whereas Queen Mary fired on Seydlitz instead of Der Flinge as she should have, meaning she was allowed to fire unmolested for almost 10 minutes. But Indefatigable and von der Tann, the two oldest and smallest battlecruisers on either side, engaged in a gunnery duel at the end of the line. Indefatigable put out some truly withering fire, firing some 40 shells at von der Tann. However, it appeared to have no noticeable effect on the German battlecruiser's rate of fire, registering 3 consecutive hits from a 4-gun salvo, her 11-inch shells hitting the forward turret and forecastle. With this success, von der Tann laid down a massive barrage of 52 11-inch shells and 38 5.9-inch shells. Taking from Nick Jellicoe's excellent book, Jutland: The Unfinished Battle, finally at 4:02 p.m. at a range of around 16,000 yards, the German shells tore through the thin plating just above the armored belt by X turret and exploded in the magazine. A second salvo hit A turret may have caused a cordite fire. 30 seconds after the superstructure was hit, a ripple of fire seemed to race from the bows right the way back the 19,000-ton battlecruiser as her magazine exploded. Only 14 minutes after opening fire did Indefatigable go down. All of her crew except for 2 went down with the ship. In Castles of Steel, the loss of Indefatigable was captured by a navigating officer looking back at the ship. We were altering course to port at the time, and it seemed as if her steering was damaged, as she did not follow around in our wake but held on until she was about 500 yards on her starboard quarter. While we were looking at her, she was again hit by 2 shells, one on the forecastle and one on the fore turret. Both shells appeared to explode on impact. There was an interval of about 30 seconds, and then the ship completely blew up. The main explosion started with sheets of flame, followed immediately by a dark, dense smoke cloud that obscured the ship from view. All sorts of stuff was blown into the air. A 50-foot picket boat being blown up about 200 feet, apparently intact though, upside down. From the German perspective, aboard von der Tann, the first artillery officer, Erich Marholtz, described the destruction as a bright sheet of flame shot out of the turret roof and expanded along the entire aft section. Debris whirled through the air, possibly fragments from the turret's roof. A monstrous black cloud of smoke rose into the air to twice the height of the topmast. Apparently, we had hit an oil tank. As I mentioned in my video on Queen Mary, a possible cause for the destruction of Indefatigable, besides her inadequate armor for such an engagement, was the fact that dating back to before the war in the Royal Navy, an emphasis was put on gunnery speed, with a faster rate of fire being preferred over careful calculation. This obsession with speed led to unsafe practices like the stacking of ammunition outside protective magazines and leaving anti-flash doors open during drills or even battle. I think the quote that I said earlier from R.A. Burt is an appropriate end to the video, so I'll repeat it. Admiral Fisher's dictum, "Speed is armor," was never better exemplified than in this class. Their extremely poor protection made them vulnerable as capital ships. Anyway, please remember to like and subscribe as it'll help the channel to grow. And until next time, my friends, have a great day.